The coronavirus is not a thing of the past. The numbers are still rising, but other issues have made it to the headlines. Europe and the United States are facing a wave of anti-racism protests. Asia has been shaken by the India-China standoff in Ladakh. The focus in West Asia has shifted to Israel's plans vis-à-vis the occupied West Bank. How big of a challenge is it for news outlets across the globe to balance reportage on the pandemic along with all these other topical issues? At what point does a deadly pandemic become the new normal? And how do you stay afloat when all sectors in almost all economies are bleeding? That includes the media. Hello and welcome to the second edition of WION Global Editors Summit. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. In conversation with me today are some of the best editors from around the world. We'll talk about the workings of a newsroom. We'll discuss challenges facing the news industry, and we will give you an insight into behind-the-camera stories. This is one-of-a-kind virtual summit, and it gives me much pleasure to introduce our panelists today. Joining me from Paris is Gallagher Fenwick. He's the head of France 24 English. Alexandru Giboi, he is the Secretary General of the European Alliance of News Agencies. And Aluf Benn, the Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz, with us from Israel. Gentlemen, welcome to WION.
Hello.
Good to have you all.
Thank you.
Yes, news is a 24/7 industry, and the last couple of months have been especially challenging for most of us. Gallagher, if I could begin with you, let me start by asking, how many hours have you been putting in at work since the pandemic struck, and does it get to you at some point?
No, this has been a major challenge, obviously, for our organization. Just from a human resources point of view, we've engaged in what could genuinely be called a sort of paradigm shift with very few people in the actual physical newsroom. So encouraging, facilitating remote production, which again is a human resources challenge, but is also a logistical, a technical challenge. The other issue, of course, is a psychological one. That is basically reassuring colleagues who still have to come to work on site that they're safe in doing so. And this, of course, goes through implementing sanitary precautions, going about, communicating on a lot of different fronts in terms of what is being done to ensure that people can work as safely as possible, but while remaining honest about the fact that, yes, indeed, once you leave your house, your home to come to work, there is a risk. So when you combine all of these different factors, yes, it does get to you at the end of the day. The hours feel far longer and far more intense than they did in a pre-COVID era. But I think there's also very many positives that are to be taken away and out of this crisis. We have a lot of staff who digital competences have really risen steadily throughout the crisis. There have been great examples of solidarity inside the newsroom and amongst colleagues. So I'd say it's not an all negative story, but it is certainly a very tough one to cover and to live through, because that's the sort of awkward situation that we as journalists are in, is that we're covering a story that for once is directly impacting each and every single one of us in the newsroom and outside the newsroom.
Indeed, I was reading back in April a piece on France 24 carried a quote from you on the impact of the pandemic, and I would like to share it with our viewers. You said that it's going to be what we decide to do collectively, but also individually as we come out of it, and we're all living through this. Aluf Benn, there's a lot of news, and most of it has been extremely depressing. Nobody is talking, or very few are talking about the mental and physical health of those who are bringing these stories. How is the mood in your newsroom, and is there a sense of fatigue there too?
The thing that happened here, which is unprecedented in two ways. One, it's a story that affects each and every one of us globally. I mean, I don't think that since the Second World War there was a story that, or anything that connected the entire globe, that you could not run away from. And you could not travel. And the second thing, which didn't happen even during the World Wars, was that it affects changes in personal and interpersonal behavior. You can't remember any time when people were asked not to shake hands when they meet each other, to wear masks wherever they go, under risk of penalty. So this is something unprecedented. And we had to learn how to cover it on the go. There was no textbook on that kind of pandemic.
Yes, and journalists...
So
thrive on interpersonal relations, yes. And all the rules are being rewritten. So, yes, it is learning on the job, as you put it. Alex Giboi, the pandemic affects all of us, not just as journalists, but also as individuals. While the whole world was in lockdown, we continued to work, many from home, but many more had to go out. And then we return to our family, our children. There's a constant sense of guilt of what we may be exposing them to. What has been your message to the newsroom, and how has your team been coping, and how have you been coping personally?
This is indeed the most special situation facing humanity for a very, very long time. And you might have heard, you might know, the expression frontline workers, and that's referring, of course, to doctors and nurses and everybody who's battling the virus directly. But I think also journalists, which now have to do practically or almost the same thing, can also be called frontline workers. Journalists who would go out on the field and gather news and report on events, which, as a predecessor of mine was speaking, they practically are living the news they are transmitting. It's like a war zone. Actually, if you are able to go to a hospital and report from that hospital, and nowadays it's not much different than reporting from a war zone, and that makes it even more difficult for journalists who then have to return home. They have to face the reality of maybe catching the virus and spreading it. But this is in fact the moment which proves that the value of journalism and the value of journalists as people are much higher and should be much more valued, because in nowadays, when we must admit that the virus is doubled by another virus, the infodemic virus. That's another pandemic, an informational pandemic who just hit the whole world, and journalism, and honest journalism, in fact, became more and more important. And we have to understand that for journalists, it's even more difficult to do their jobs with all the pressure going around from maybe newsrooms, from maybe shareholders, stakeholders. It's very difficult, and then think, as you said, that they might go home and infect their loved ones. So we have examples of very, very beautiful solidarity in the media during the past few months. From our own experience, from EANA, the European Alliance of News Agencies, we had members who were in a very difficult situation. For example, we had the Croatian news agency, who by chance, who would have thought at the beginning of the pandemic, Croatia was hit by a very nasty earthquake, and they were helped by their friends from other EANA members. So this is proving to the world the fact that journalism is something which is very much alive, but it's at the same time very much human. And that is very important to take note of, because people have all sorts of requests from journalists. They trust journalism more or less, but they should know that honest journalism is vital during these days, during this past few months, and will be even more so in the future for escaping what we call the infodemics, the informational pandemic. So yes, I think it's a difficult situation, but I think at the same time it's the chance that maybe real and honest journalism needed to prove its value for societies.
Indeed, very well put. And we used to say that we are sending reporters to the front line. I think the front line has now come to the newsroom, and the allegorical references to war keep coming up. Gallagher, 3 years back, you were reporting from Iraq, if I'm not wrong, when people were exposed to toxic agents. Now, we are in the middle of this unique health crisis, and it's being compared to an active war zone. People have compared this COVID-19 outbreak to a world war. When you compare the two situations, how different or similar are these two stories?
for me as a manager in the newsroom, what is particularly challenging and interesting and fascinating to a certain degree is that you have a whole bunch of people who work to produce journalism, quality journalism, day in and day out, and who've never thought of their job as being a dangerous one. For instance, line producers, junior editors who come in and just sit in front of a computer and edit, pieces and whatnot. And they've been doing so for a number of years and never that they imagine one day being scared of coming to work in this, seemingly anodyne place, carpets, neon lights, that they have never regarded as, being a particularly hazardous environment. And overnight, it did become that because, and I'm not a big fan of the war metaphor. As you said, I have covered and been toward this a very different situation. But it's very true that once that a metaphor started going around, you had this idea that this very pervasive idea that the enemy is invisible and therefore danger lurks everywhere, in your keyboards, on doorknobs, but perhaps more insidiously, the other, meaning others, are potential enemies because we human beings are the ones who transmit and carry the virus, and that had the potential to have a devastating effect in terms of further separating, dividing people, making them more wary of each other. So that was one aspect that was, very unique in this situation. The fear factor is definitely there. And again, this idea that on the contrary to, traditional, if I can call it, there's war zones where you have areas where you can feel safe and are genuine places of refuge because you're putting, a sufficient amount of distance between yourself and the source of fire or hostility. In this particular instance, the enemy is invisible, so you feel somewhat safe inside your house. But for people like me who come to work, who have to use public transportation and go out, you might potentially be bringing the enemy, namely the virus, inside your own homes. And that means that you're feeling unsafe, potentially so, 24/7. So that's very different, and that makes this situation very, very intense. And as you can see in the way human beings adapt to these types of situations is that, and this is very normal, it's a sort of biological reaction, which is that at first everyone was extremely tense, very guarded, very cautious, perhaps excessively so. And then after a while, because you simply cannot sustain in the medium long term that level of intensity, people go for the exact opposite attitude, which is that they're careless. They don't care anymore. They think, well, if I catch it, so be it. And if my family catches it, so be it. And if I infect my neighbors or my friends or peers, so be it. So that's really another one of the major challenges that I've encountered, is encouraging people to find a sustainable middle ground in terms of the kinds of attitudes that we all need to adopt and the intensity we need to put in this struggle.
Aluf Benn, as someone from Israel, maybe you can shed light on this, how to be living with this constant security challenge and at the same time not letting your guard down and not making or treating that situation as blasé. Israel also has seen, as you said, 3 general elections in a year, and now we have this pandemic, and you've dealt with very many difficult stories. Is this one of the most challenging ones that you've had to cover?
We're always in the mood of contingency. It is, as I said, it is challenging to cover for several reasons. First of all, it's unprecedented in our lifetime. So, for the first time, the healthcare reporters become the front page story.
Yeah.
So they had to adapt to it as well. Number 3, everybody's interested. We get a lot of feedback from readers about coronavirus data, how many tests were taken, how many people were affected, how many are in hospitals, how many died, etc. People are obsessed about this information, and also there's a debate going on in Israel. I guess that it's the same all over the place, whether the government actions to stop the spread of the coronavirus are too intrusive in terms of privacy, in terms of civil rights. There's a big issue in Israel with using the security service technologies to spy on people, on people infected with the virus, in order to find out who was in their vicinity through tracking their mobile phones. Right now, as we speak, the Israeli cabinet is once again debating the issue whether to use the security service technology that was developed in order to combat terrorism.
Global Editors Summit, co-powered by Amazon Prime Video. In association with Chroma, a Tata enterprise. Brighter every day.
In association with Amrita Vishwa Vidyapeetham School of Engineering.
It's a wicked world for every boy and every girl. It's a wicked world. Wicked world. Put a spell on me.
Enjoy sinfully entertaining originals only on Amazon Prime Video.
Medical advice on coronavirus or general medical doubts? Star Health Insurance offers free telemedical consultation with expert doctors, always at your doorstep.
It's a brighter day, a brighter day. Every day, it's how we take it once we make it. A brighter day every day, a brighter day every day. Na 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 na.
With visualizations, concept learning and movie-like videos, Byju's is the best way to learn at home.
तो पढ़ाई की लड़ाई खत्म करो. Let's download the Byju's app now.
माँ भूख लगी, जल्दी प्लीज।
हाँ बेटा।
आज तो टंकी फुल चाहिए।
क्यों, कहाँ जा रहे हो?
वो कल बाइक रैली है पापा।
आज मेरा वो मोती जिंदा होता ना तो दिखा देता।
पापा, आपका मोती फिर से जिंदा हो गया। और हाँ मम्मी, वो गणेश जी की फ्रेश रोटी, आज पापा लंबा दौड़ेंगे।
फ्रेश गणेश होल व्हीट चक्की आटा। फ्रेश स्टार्ट करना है तो फ्रेश खाना पड़ता है। गणेश आटा।
Medical advice on coronavirus or general medical doubts? Star Health Insurance offers free telemedical consultation with expert doctors, always at your doorstep.
It's a brighter day, a brighter day. Every day, it's how we take it once we make it. A brighter day every day, a brighter day every day. Na 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 na.
It's a wicked world for every boy and every girl. It's a wicked world. Wicked world. Put a spell on me.
Enjoy sinfully entertaining originals only on Amazon Prime Video.
माँ भूख लगी, जल्दी प्लीज।
हाँ बेटा।
आज तो टंकी फुल चाहिए।
क्यों, कहाँ जा रहे हो?
वो कल बाइक रैली है पापा।
आज मेरा वो मोती जिंदा होता ना तो दिखा देता।
पापा, आपका मोदी फिर से जिंदा हो गया। और हाँ मम्मी, वो गणेश जी की फ्रेश रोटी, आज पापा लंबा दौड़ेंगे।
फ्रेश गणेश होल व्हीट चक्की आटा। फ्रेश स्टार्ट करना है तो फ्रेश खाना पड़ता है। गणेश आटा।
कोरोना महामारी से बचाव का एक उत्तम उपाय है स्ट्रॉन्ग इम्यूनिटी। इसीलिए डाबर लाया है इम्यूनिटी किट, जिसमें है डाबर च्यवनप्राश, डाबर हनी टस, डाबर गिलोय, अश्वगंधा और डाबर इम्यूटैब, यानी आपके परिवार का सुरक्षा कवच। Dabur.com और आपके नजदीकी स्टोर्स पर उपलब्ध।
Global Editors Summit, co-powered by Amazon Prime Video. In association with Chroma, a Tata enterprise. Brighter every day.
In association with Amrita Vishwa Vidyapeetham School of Engineering.
Alex Giboi, you mentioned fake news earlier, and there are many hidden pandemics, I think, that the world is going to face in the days and weeks ahead. Fake news was, of course, around even before the pandemic, but it's become more acute because we're talking about matters of life and death mostly. Regulation is important, but do you think that a lot of governments are also misusing this health crisis to silence critical media?
I think one of the most important factors in fighting disinformation before the pandemic and during the pandemic and after the pandemic is media literacy, is preparing the public to be able to identify on its own the possible disinformation campaigns or fake news. That's the most certain way in which we make sure that our governments will not use or will not be able to use regulation in media in order to fight disinformation.
So fake news is a challenge. Technology is another. Gallagher, we've all been forced into this sudden learning curve, and we're all learning to deal with how to use technology the best way possible to ensure that news goes out uninterrupted. Working from home in television was unheard of, but we are doing it. The other challenge that we face is the finances, of course. Very often people forget that the media is also a business and journalists need salaries. What hits the economy hits us too. How are you coping with the financial slide?
Well, you know, I think there's kind of a sort of a buffer zone between the actual crisis and the impact financially of it, which is that for now, I mean, we are seeing, you know, some of our financial numbers drop, but it's not yet, you know, very concretely impacting us from a human resources point of view. And by that I mean is that we're not yet at the point where we're having to, you know, let people go, fire people, or ask people to take unpaid sabbaticals or things like that. Will we get there? That remains to be seen, simply because there's so many unknowns that go into this equation that it makes it all the more difficult to pull out the crystal ball and try to, you know, sort of decipher how this is going to play out. As Mr. Aluf Benn has been, you know, saying, you know, and has said a number of times today, this is very much an unprecedented situation. These are uncharted waters. So the end goal is, of course, to survive. And another word that I wanted to bring into this conversation that we've heard a lot, especially out here in France, it was the name of a military operation where the French army came out and sort of helped cope with the crisis by handling some of the COVID-19 patients, by putting together field hospitals, things completely unprecedented in the nation's history. The word that came up and that gave its name to this operation was resilience. And this is it's a stress test. It's a stress test for governments, for nations, for people, and for organizations like ours. So yes, indeed, you know, advertising is, you know, heavily being impacted. Keep in mind that at France 24, we're part of France's public media consortium. So we have, you know, government subsidies that we live off of. Now the government is looking at its priorities, national priorities, and is having to make some tough decisions in terms of, you know, where do we want to inject funds? Where are our priorities? What does our nation need most? Does it need, you know, plane manufacturers? Does it need public media? Does it need, you know, better hospitals? Does it need car manufacturers that employ thousands of people throughout the country? And these tough choices are on the table right now as we speak. They're being made. So undoubtedly, we are going to feel the brunt of this at some point. It's just not happening right now. People are feeling a little bit, smug to a certain extent because we have survived, or so it seems, this crisis. And we did relatively well. Our numbers, probably like Mr. Aluf Benn's Haaretz or Alex's outlets, skyrocketed. So we're feeling pretty content to come. It's not here right, but it undoubtedly will come at some point. And the question is, how sharp will it be?
Indeed. Aluf Benn, you mentioned advertising. Now, the times are especially difficult. It's always a challenge to bring ad revenue without compromising the integrity of news. In India, for example, I can tell you that there's a boycott China wave, and it's a very sentimental issue. But news channels are running those debates with Chinese companies as sponsors. Where do you draw the line, and how much should you resist becoming a part of the story?
Well, we don't really have we're not really facing these dilemmas, and we're trying to offset some of the revenue decline with selling more subscriptions, because people are reading or browsing or consuming the news much more than in usual times. So there is some opportunity there, and like everybody else in the business, we've been for several years now in the declining ad revenues. Most ad revenues in the world go to Facebook and Google. We cannot compete with them. We're not even trying to. So I think that what we see here is an acceleration of a process of technological disruption that would have happened anyway. So you have to be prepared. And since you cannot get much more revenue, we're trying to cut costs. So, we're cutting back on real estate, on parking spaces, we even closed the office gym. These are small things, but most importantly, they're totally transparent to our readers. We don't feel it. And we all know that we're going through a difficult time. We don't know how long this is going to take. And we're doing our best to keep the journalistic product as good as possible.
Right. Alex Giboi, we were talking about government subsidies. So subsidizing or helping an automaker or an airline tide over this crisis is one thing. In the government's involvement in the media is quite another. How much involvement is too much, and where do you draw the line?
If the state would be involved in helping media, it could be involved in general measures like loosening of taxes, for example. Not directly pushing money into media, because that would create a precedent. And that would create a situation in which journalism and journalists would not feel, I think, comfortable working for the state, let's say like this. Yeah. So this is my opinion on this.
Right. I think we're running out of time. The one last question that I want to ask each one of you, starting with Gallagher perhaps, what is the biggest takeaway for you from this pandemic, and the one story that stayed with you?
To be honest with you, I think that for me what's at stake right now is whether or not we are truly facing a rupture, meaning did we just go through, a moment that will trigger profound change human beings, perhaps for the better or the worse? Or will, in France's case, September 2020 be the exact same as February 2020? In France, February 2020 is the month that preceded the climax of this crisis. So the big question is, do we sort of, take things away on an individual basis from this crisis, try to implement changes that hopefully will bring about, positive things? Or we just go back to the same old ways? And I'm not entirely sure of what the answer to that question is yet. Again, because I think some people expect change to fall from the sky, or for governments or from sort of entities, flying above their heads. Others have understood that it will take, decisions on an individual level, but will there be enough people who will reach critical mass to head towards something different collectively? I'm not entirely sure. And for us as a media organization, the other question is, are we able to sustain this growth that we went through during this crisis, or now that we've reached a sort of COVID fatigue moment where people are sort of sick and tired of the COVID stories, will they step away from us and go back to the infotainments that they probably used to consume before they went to France 24, Haaretz, or Mr. Alex's outlet? I'm not entirely sure. I mean, there's the question of, have our audiences, the people who read us, the people who watch us, have they changed? I'm not entirely sure, and that's what's at stake for me and I think for us here at France 24 in Paris.
Right. Aluf Benn, same question to you. What is the one thing that has stayed with you and your biggest takeaway?
Well, first of all, it's too early to tell because, as time goes by, I realize that this is a crisis that is going to shadow us for quite a while. It's not the 6-day war, as we say in Israel. It's a long process. What surprised me was that many people, when it began, prominent writers and philosophers and so on, wrote their visions for the post-pandemic world. And the structure was more or less the same. It was like, this pandemic is going to change the world, and then it's going to change it in the way that I thought should have been before the pandemic. In other words, I'm not changing my mind, but I expect anybody else to change their minds. So I think it's too early to tell which big story is going to come out of it. Changing the way people go to work, new technologies for communications. Will people eventually go back to handshaking and hugging each other, or keeping distance? I think these are big questions that are too early to tell. People are still digesting what's happening. They're still thinking about going to some family trip abroad in August, which is apparently not going to happen. But that's the way they used to do things.
Alex Giboi, final comments.
I think it's a period to be optimist, I think. Because if you look back in history, each extremely difficult moment was followed by a revival of humanity. So in my opinion, we should maintain optimism. At the same time, I'm not a prophet, and I can't say what is going to happen in 1 month or 2 months or 3 months. For example, EANA, my organization, which is made out of 32 news agencies from all over Europe, canceled a few events because of this exact pandemic, and we don't know what's going to happen in 1 month. So I don't really trust the people who predict that in 1 year or in 2 years things will be very much different or very much the same. I think what we all should do is focus on crossing this crisis well and maintaining our values, which is very, very important. If there are opportunities to be achieved and to be accessed, then we should do that, but only for the evolution of all humanity. And that is my message for this end of a very interesting conversation.
Thank you for saying that. I hope you all enjoyed it, and thank you for making time. It was good to have you all. This is, as you said, a state of flux that we are in, and we hope we come out of it with better stories to tell. Thank you.